Yes, I now also click live on YouTube. So, hello everyone. I would like to give a really warm welcome to our amazing attendees coming from all over the world, coming to our United Nations Virtual Forum on Responsible Business and Human Rights today. So we are at the last session of today, which is about the impact of COVID-19 on internal migrant workers in India. So yes, you're in the right time at the right place with the workshop today. And we are really excited to have you join us. We have amazing speakers, amazing panelists coming from different parts of the world to share their insight with us today. For our webinar today, I will be your technical facilitator to ensure we have a smooth experience using Zoom. Just a quick note, if you have any questions you would like to share with our panelists, you can go to the Q&A box and type in your question there. Our team will go through all the questions and we'll select a few to answer in front of our big group. Yes, we still have about 2 minutes to go and it's a rising number of participants every second. Right now we have 44 participants to join us. Very exciting. This webinar is also being recorded. And we are officially live on YouTube. If you would like to invite your friend to join the live stream watching party, please feel free to do so. Wonderful. And right now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator of today. Please join me in welcome Salil.
Thank you. Hello, how are you? And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever part of the world you are in. I have a fantastic panel and from which I'm going to learn a lot, and I hope so will all of us, to understand what has happened in the context of the crisis of COVID, the coronavirus crisis, and the impact it has had on some of the most vulnerable people, those who have the agency and those who have the power but are not able to wield it. And what we are going to talk about is the situation and the context in India, where the crisis has been particularly acute. Before I get into the preamble, let me briefly set out where we stand today. India probably did not have a choice but to have a lockdown like almost every other country. It needed to do that because given the large size of the population, given the density in which people live, it was inevitable that the disease might spread rapidly. India has had outbreaks of other diseases in the past, which have been difficult to cope. And India also has an reasonably efficient health infrastructure, but sometimes it can fall apart at the seams. And how not to do that and how to ensure that the system will be able to deliver, system will be able to look after, and the state will be able to ensure that it protects the rights of everybody, it needed to take drastic action. It did take the action, but the consequences of which have been quite harrowing for the people who were at the receiving end of it. And some of the most vulnerable people were hit hard. These are the people who leave their own home and work in other parts of India. They have the right to do so under the Indian Constitution and under the right to free movement. And they did go out and they did work in and they built the malls of India, the roads of India. They plucked the fruit at Indian in gardens. They kept the cities and the towns working. And when this decision was made, they found themselves in a helpless situation. In some cases, they were asked to leave wherever they were working. They were not even necessarily paid the money that was due to them. And they were asked to remain where they were, which made them even more vulnerable. And a repeating theme we've heard from many of the workers has been the fact that they were in a situation which essentially meant they had to choose between death by the disease or death by starvation, and they chose to go home. And we will then see how that unfolded and what the consequences are and what the role of the companies should be, because a lot of the companies, large and small, were either direct employers or they were employing them as part of the supply chain. And what responsibilities did they have in this context? All these are fairly vital questions to ask and ponder. I'm Salil. I live in New York and I work with the Institute for Human Rights and Business. We are looking very closely at the impact of COVID on communities, on companies, and the kind of responses that the companies are fashioning. With me on the panel today, I have 6 excellent speakers. The first is, I'm in no particular order, but it's the order in which I will be asking questions. The first is Chinmay Tumbe, who is a young academic from the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, where he has written the book called India Moving, A History of Migration. We also have Shubho Roy, who is a behavior economist, and he is with a company called Bias, which is not what you think it is, but he will tell you why it is called Bias when he speaks, and he has studied the situation. We also have Sudarshana Kundu, who is joining us from Hyderabad. Sudarshana is in with Gender at Work, which is a consultancy, a think tank, a civil society organization that works to ensure that women's rights are respected and women are empowered and we eliminate our biases. We also have Vani Saraswati, who's joining us from Bangalore in India. Vani is actually looking at the Indian worker who goes abroad, those who are in the Persian Gulf, the Middle East, and the situation in which they find themselves. And that's itself is a story about not just the Indians who travel within the country, but those who travel elsewhere. Then we have Chandan Kumar. Chandan works with the workers directly. His organization has intervened in the matter in the Supreme Court on a couple of cases. And he's closest among all of us with the workers who are directly affected. And finally, we have Priya Naik. And Priya is with an organization called Samhita, which is trying to ensure that the companies which are part of the whole corporate social responsibility framework that is emerging in India, how they are dealing with the CSR policies and how they can be fashioned in a way that respects human rights and that makes sure that the rights are protected and the way the companies act are responsible. Thank you, all of you. And even if you applaud each other, no one will hear it, but it's wonderful to share this space with you over the next 85 minutes. My first question is going to be to you, Chinmay. Chinmay, since you've written the book and you looked at the issue of migration and people on the move in India for some time now, and you have a historical and economic perspective that you've dealt with in the book. Have you ever seen a situation or a crisis on this scale? And how acute do you think the current crisis is?
Yeah, thanks, Anil. This is probably the most acute migration crisis India has ever faced in its history. And I say that after understanding Indian history in a variety of episodes, including partition, which was again a mass migration story. Let me just start with a very quick idea about what happens in India. I've argued in my book, for example, that India experiences something called as the Great Indian Migration Wave, which is the world's largest and longest mostly voluntary migration system, which has been happening since about the 1870s. So the districts, the regions of India, which are most affected by out-migration and now return migration, have been pretty much the same places, whether it's Eastern Uttar Pradesh in the north, Bihar, coastal Orissa, districts in the Konkan, districts in Rajasthan, pretty much the same regions which have been sending out people for more than 100 years. And this is a system of circular migration, which has very deep historical origins, and which have in the past been affected by pandemics. Right? So we had the plague in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, and you had the great influenza epidemic of 1918. And in both the times, people basically fled back home. And of course, one line of thought suggests that this actually intensified those epidemics. And so if you contain people the epidemic would not have been spread, and that was the rationale this time around. But what for me, both episodes, whether then or now, shows you the intense need for migrants to go back home during the crisis. And what's common between 100 years back and now is the intense sort of vulnerability that migrants face in their destinations. That means if there's no income for a few weeks, for a few months, there's virtually no way you can live in the city. And this ties onto this idea that for a long time in Indian history, migrants have gone to seek economic security in the city or in some destination area, but the social security, which means the family, but also public support, that is public welfare systems, have been tied to your place of birth, domicile, your ration, which is at the source. So economic security in the city, but social security in the village. And so the minute the economic security dried up during the lockdown, people basically just fled. So this instant flight behavior has been, remarkably similar 100 years back and even today. But 100 years back, the railways worked, and so people did walk. And that's what's different this time around. That is, this time is the first time, probably in 150 years, that the Indian railways were shut down. And the Indian railways, when people who work on migration in India know, it's the lifeline of workers in India. So the dramatic shutdown of the Indian railways, I think, was a huge also psychological shock. And so people, absolutely desperate, they started walking. So how acute is this crisis? I think if you look at major, of course, there are city-wise slowdowns always. There have been industrial recessions and people have gone back. This is the first time that all of India is back home at the same time. In the sense, a lot of people go back for, variety of things, for the monsoon, etc. But this time people have gone back 1 month earlier than scheduled in many parts. People would have gone back for festivals. For example, many people went for Holi. But this time, but festivals happen at different points of time in different parts of it. This time, everyone is back home at the same time. And the railways, which was always open for 150 years, were shut down. So these are the two big differences between now and then. That is, it's hit just vastly more people. I've estimated about 30 million people are now back home. That represents easily about 15 to 20% of the urban workforce. So it's a very, very acute crisis.
Thank you, Chinmay. That's a very sobering statistics and figures. And I think the distinction between economic and social security is a critical one. And I think we will have to circle back and speak about that in a bit. Shubho, you have done some research recently through your colleagues and spoken to these people and heard their stories. You've spoken to migrant workers in different states. With the Institute for Human Rights and Business, we are going to work together on a possible publication soon. So thank you for that. What are the key things that you have found in your work?
Hi. Yeah. So today I could be Ramu, Shamu, anything, because I am amazed because today I'm the spokesperson for all these migrant workers. Okay, so 200 odd migrant workers whom have been studying ever since the lockdown started. So from what we did was that, Selin and the panelists, that we started tracking people who left town. And by town, I mean 3 centers, mainly from West Bengal city, which capital Kolkata, or from Mumbai, Maharashtra, to other places, or from Delhi. And we studied them continuously over this period. So from till the first day to the last day, which was yesterday, lockdown 5, when it got over. The key findings, I'll say 5 points for each of the questions. First point, as it was in the instant flight is a syndrome that we are seeing for hundreds of years. We wanted to study that more from a behavioral science perspective. We wanted to know what was it. Because as an assumption, there were 2 possible cognitive biases at play. One was what we call an optimism bias, where the brain tends to assign lesser probability for a negative outcome. So more optimistic about things going right than things going wrong. So we want to study whether that led to the instant flight. Why did these people leave all of a sudden? Okay. The second was what we call a loss aversion bias, where the human brains are more loss pro than gain pro. So in other words, that we are more loss averse than gain pro. So we wanted to know what was that play. Interestingly, when we asked them and when we surveyed, at the surface level, they would give 2 reasons. They would say that, okay, with loss of livelihood, as Chinmay was talking about it, economic, so we had to leave. Okay. The second was forced evacuation. which I want to talk about a little bit more. The moment there was a lockdown was announced, and within 4 hours, the contractors or other people came over, and there was panic, and they were told, leave as soon as possible. And they were also told that, you know what, if you have to stay there in the lockdown, you have to stay, okay? But the landlords and others were not willing to do that. Now, imagine a situation where on one hand, you want people to stay home, but for that you need homes. That was the second reason. So then we started studying it further. We wanted to understand what else would have led to this. Was it the optimism bias, where they were not scared of contracting the disease? Or was it a loss aversion, okay, where they would have been scared of the losses and hence should have stayed back? You know what the answer was when you dig deeper? People are not scared of dying. People are scared of dying alone, Saleh. When people leave, the reason of this instant flight, when people panic, when people think that, okay, on one hand, I'm as it is going to die because I won't have a livelihood option. On the other hand, they're scaring me about a disease called COVID. I need to get out of this place. Even if I die, I'll be dying with my own people at the home. And that's a point that I wanted to make. Okay. Second question was that once they reached there, did they rue their decisions of leaving a more prosperous place where they were working and going to their villages? No, they were not. A whopping 96% of my target group were happy with their decision. And there's a story that I have shared with you earlier, the joy of quarantine. When they went back, because they were closer to their own people and they could see them at a distance, or even if the quarantine facilities were not, let's say, as good or as advanced as they were supposed to be in the main towns where they were working, they were still happy because they were among their own place, okay, and own people. So that's the second one I would want to talk about.
Just one more minute, Shubho, if you can speed up a little bit. Yeah.
Sure. And the last point is that when we were tracking them in terms of are they planning to come back, when we started capturing the data at the early onset, 75% wanted to come back. Then in the middle, when we did it around mid of May, okay, almost 35% were willing to come back. Okay, now it's almost 30%. So it's dropping. They do not want to come back at this point of time. So those are some of the key insights.
No, it's fascinating, absolutely. And I look forward to reading more of the research and continuing the work with you. Thank you, Shubho. Sudarshana, I want to turn to you next. And there is a question from the question and answer panel from Prabhat Kumar, and I want to see if you can weave it in. It doesn't mean you have to, but I will say what that is also the question. But
Sure.
Sudarshana, can you identify the gender-based impacts of the migrant crisis in what were women particularly vulnerable? And Prabhat has said that the challenges are even harder for the children of the migrants. Now, I don't want to say women and children are a vulnerable cohort as such, but in your response, if you can bring in what children, because we've heard some very courageous stories of this young girl,
who cycled all the way
absolutely
to take her birth. Yeah.
Weave in that as well. That would be very good. And what kind of interventions can be developed? Thank you.
Sure. So that's so I'll try and kind of answer it very briefly, and then we can get into details as we go further. So one of the things that probably I just want to kind of talk about a little bit, saying that, when we talk of migrants, it's not a homogeneous category as such, right? There are different versions of migrants, and I know Vani is going to talk of migrants who are outside, and what I'm going to talk about more is about the internal migration, about the domestic migration. And even here, there is migrants who are migrant workers, and there are migrants who are actually part of families who've moved. So there are both these categories to kind of think of. In terms of the migrant workers, the COVID has kind of shown, and I guess we needed to see a crisis of this enormity to kind of see the precarity of women migrant workers, right? Many of these women migrant workers are in occupations such as street vendors, they are in the hospitality industry, they're in the healthcare industry, they're in the tourism industry, and they're in sort of export industries like the garment sector and apparel industries. Now, the first thing that has really happened, and these, they are mostly about 90% of India's women workers are in the informal sector. So they're in contracts which have pretty much either a daily wage contract and with very little social security, either very small or almost negligible. So the first impact that has happened is, of course, loss of livelihood, right? Because they're not really covered by any of the larger formal labor protections that might have been there for them. So that's the first thing that's happened. The second is that because they're not part of the formal labor protection, they are in some ways almost undocumented. And if you have got some data, it's very difficult to actually get gender disaggregated data a lot for migrant workers, right? So these are they're undocumented, and largely the private sector or state government response has bypassed them in terms of the measures in terms of relief packages, cash assistance programs that have really gone to them, right? They've not really been able to access them. So that's the first thing. The third thing in terms of loss of livelihood is, if you think about some of these like domestic workers, right? We have about 5 million domestic workers, right? Again, undocumented, they're not going to get any kinds of labor protection. There are professions like sex workers, right? Which don't even get counted as work. And we're not even thinking about it. And these sets of categories of workers are now very close to penury, because they really have no savings, no income whatsoever. These other impacts are really secondary, and I'll really be brief right now about them. One is sort of the access to healthcare services. The sexual and reproductive healthcare services women have been really hit hard by that. We've seen examples and stories of that one pregnant woman who was refused by 9 hospitals and then she died. So maternal healthcare services have been, women have been really hit by maternal healthcare services. The other thing that we have to remember is not only in India, but globally, the healthcare industry functions really on the labor of women workers and women migrant workers in many cases, who are also facing stigma and racism in the cases of India, given their ethnicity in many cases, right? So we have to kind of think about that. And in terms of the healthcare, so the child, we are seeing, and just responding to Pratap, the issues around vaccination, issues around some of these taking them to primary healthcare centers, they're also getting really affected, right? And related to that, because, since we're talking about children, what has happened with a lot of, about 700, I think we're talking about large proportions of children who are out of school. All children are out of school right now. And therefore the care burden on women have really increased. And there's going to be a huge inequity for children who are out of school and the ones who, of course, privileged and can get onto online classes. But most of the children of migrant workers have absolutely no access to schools. The other, and very briefly, there's been a huge spurt in domestic violence. We're seeing this across, again, not only in India, but globally. And it's very hard to actually now reach them because most of the legal services, any of them are really shut and they can't even go there and actually access those. The other is in terms of information access services, because most of the time the women, it does not actually have access to the phone, especially smartphones. And a lot of your information services with respect to COVID, with respect to, even the domestic violence helplines, for example, these were all online. These were all through phones or smartphones, all of those, and women have really had no access to these, right? So they're either women migrant workers in particular are either victims of misinformation, or they even lack access to basic information around some of these that have been including some of the relief packages that have been spread across. So this is where we are right now. in terms of what's actually happened to women migrant workers.
Again, extremely sobering. Thank you, Sudarshana. Vani, I'm going to turn to you, and Sudarshana actually gave a very neat segue by actually referring to the situation that you look into, which is, of course, the problem outside India for Indian workers. And of course, your focus has been on Indian workers in the Gulf region, but we have seen some very harrowing accounts of workers abroad being stranded, projects being stopped, and they literally on starving. You worked extensively on the issue, and tell us how grim the situation is. And another question which you may be able to comment on is it in terms of responding. There are other countries which are also labor exporting, such as Bangladesh and Philippines and Indonesia and Pakistan. How has the Indian response been in comparison when you look at the host governments such as the countries in the Middle East? And again, in 3 or 4 minutes so that we can move on. Yeah. Vani?
Vani on mute, yeah.
Vani, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I did. Can you hear me? Yeah. So just stop me if I'm rambling on because it's quite a wide subject. We're talking about 6 countries, and each of the 6 Gulf countries have their own nuances. In total, you're talking about close to 90 lakh Indians by the most conservative estimates in the Gulf region, the majority in UAE and Saudi Arabia. And what we also saw was very early on in the process, 3 countries, Bahrain, Kuwait, and UAE, were forcing origin countries to take back their citizens. Kuwait and Bahrain did it as an amnesty program, which meant those who were irregular, who did not have an employer to be held accountable, were encouraged to go back. At that point, India refused to take in the migrants because the airports were closed. And many of those flights, especially from Kuwait, were free flights. It was supposed to, the Kuwait government was paying for those flights, but they couldn't send back Indians. And there were about 40,000 still waiting in Kuwait, irregular workers who had sought amnesty. The issue is twofold. One is those who are on a regular status, whose employers are struggling during this period. The other are the irregular workers. These are the ones who've either been forced into irregularity because of the nature of the kafala system that doesn't give the worker agency to renew their visas. So it falls on the employer. But when the employer fails to do it, it's the worker who's penalized, right? So you have very, very large numbers of irregular workers in all of these countries of Indian origin and also from other countries. And then you have the ones who have employers who, even before COVID, one thing we need to keep in mind is the economy there, except for maybe Abu Dhabi, one of the Emirates of the UAE, and Qatar, the economy has been doing well. But all of the other economies have been struggling. So there have been huge issues with labor, non-payment of wages, stranded workers, even before COVID. And it's just magnified now. And companies that had a problem even before COVID are using this as an excuse to exploit the new regulations put in place by these governments. When I say new regulations, similar to what India did with the labor law, those governments have almost given unilateral power to businesses to either put workers on unpaid leave or reduce wages or terminate them. Unilateral change of contract. And we're seeing that quite a bit. Now, what is the role of the Indian missions? They're supposed to help workers reclaim wages that they haven't been paid for months, which at the best of times, even before this crisis, the missions were not equipped to do this because we do not have labor attaches, we have labor officers. So you need a separate labor attache, you need a separate system to take care of it, which Philippines has a very good labor grievances redressal mechanism, all of the labor receiving countries, which India doesn't have, even though it's the largest labor exporter in the world. Now, this, they all put repatriation. We said, but if you look at the fares being charged, it's double the cost of what a one-way was in February, April. I could go from Doha to Chennai for 600 riyals or 700 riyals one-way ticket. Now it costs 1,200. That's $300. Most workers can't afford it. So that the repatriation flights are really catering to those with families who have money. Now, if you look at some of the countries like Saudi, for instance, where there are a lot of Indians, there's like, just looking at some statistics here, about 30 lakhs, many of them with their families, they pay a family tax. So that's something that Saudi introduced very recently. They're unable to pay family taxes. So they become irregular because either visa hasn't been renewed or they haven't paid the tax, and they cannot leave the country till they've paid the fines. Now, these are issues that can be resolved bilaterally with negotiations, which we've seen other countries do, and that hasn't happened yet. Maybe because there is a current fire to fight and they're ignoring the smaller fires, they're just focusing on the big one. In terms of access to healthcare, some countries are doing better than the others, but if you look at the UAE, for instance, we keep getting cases of workers. We try to, either facilitate it or connect them to authorities, workers who've tested positive, but don't get treatment, even if they're symptomatic, because the health system is not able to manage it. A country like Qatar, for instance, has discriminatory healthcare facilities, but they're good facilities. They're still cheap. I mean, they're still free, and they treat everyone. It's just not the same thing. But these are things that, unfortunately, in case of India, we don't, our relationship with the Gulf states, it's not only about labor export, which is the case, say, with Nepal or Bangladesh or Philippines. India has other trades with these countries. There's a mutual dependency, and we've never effectively exploited that to have better bilateral terms. And that is becoming really evident currently. And another huge issue we find is most of the countries do not have shelters. Only Kuwait and Bahrain have shelters, and it's for women. There is a trafficking shelter in UAE. There are no shelters for men. So usually when someone wants to return home, they will turn themselves into the deportation and detention centers, and they'll be detained until repatriation. Now, those centers are not taking in anyone. We are finding thousands of workers homeless in these countries. It's summer, start of summer, and it's the summer in Gulf is unbearable. You can't step out even for 2 minutes during the day. And now they're homeless, they're being evicted, their water and electricity is being cut in places like Bahrain by the government, because in the name of decongesting labor camps, they're cutting these utilities. And again, when workers go to the Indian embassy and they're talking about, a lot of them are not willing to return to India. I found what Shubho was mentioning earlier about the different reasons why people would leave or stay back. For a lot of the workers there, it's really horrible. But the reason they can't leave is they've invested so much in their migration, and they have wages due for a year. They have end of service benefits. If they do not receive any of that, they don't want to come back. And we're seeing an increase in suicides. Almost every week we hear of suicides in Bahrain and in Kuwait. And it's because they don't want to go back home empty-handed and face a family that's in poverty when, quite a bit of money is due to them from their employer. And neither the governments there nor the Indian embassies there have the legal resources to look into it and to fast track these cases. I'll stop here now.
No, I think the point you raised on debt bondage is an extremely important one. It is an issue in India too. And of course, India has laws against bonded labor as passed 30, 40 years ago. But as we know from the global situation, and at the Institute, again, we have a program on responsible recruitment leadership group, which also looks at issues like that. So it's a very real issue. Chandan, I want to come to you now, and looking at from the situation in India, the court interventions you were talking about, and also reflect a bit on the question that Shubho had raised about whether people want to return or not. And there was a question from someone in the audience as well, asking exactly the same thing. Why would they not work, or why would they work? So, I mean, certainly I want to hear about what you're hearing from workers directly, but also about what are their motivations about staying or leaving. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much, Salil, and the organizers for putting this wonderful panel. Yes, I don't know from where to start, where to end. Today is my 74th day. I have been working on ground with my comrades and friends across almost 16, 17 states across the country. And I can tell you, though, I don't want to basically give you the theoretical perspective, just tell you that what I'm seeing on the ground every day. on that situation. I think the post 1990, when the India introduced the economic liberalization, and then the era basically grew up, and 2001 to 2020, last 20 years, we have seen the kind of the ugly the faces of the new liberal policies across the country, and we have always heard that this narrative very powerfully built by the new liberal politics, that the cities are engines of economic growth, and 2 months lockdown, the entire growth have collapsed. So you see the situation that how cities are so ugly, cities are so disrespectful to the city makers, cities are so brutal to the working poor of this country, the people who build the cities, build the roads, build the buildings, build everything. I mean, I'm personally ashamed, to be called as a citizens. We failed as a nation, we failed as a citizens, we failed to uphold the constitutional promises, what we made promises while building the nation. I'm absolutely ashamed about it. Look at the situation, what's happening in the country. When the trains are going and reaching to the eastern parts of the country, and when the railway staff is coming and cleaning the trains, there are dead bodies coming out. I mean, what kind of society we are building it up? People are walking on the railway tracks because on the street, on the roads, the police are doing the brutal behavior, right? And the trains is running over the workers, and people are getting down on the railway tracks. And the laughable fact is that the Solicitor General of India, I'll talk about it because we are intervening in Supreme Court matter also, and today the order came. I want to talk about that. And the Solicitor General is saying in the courtroom that if the workers will be walking on the railway tracks, they have to die, they're bound to die. And they are saying that we people like us and activists like us are instigating violence, we are pushing workers to come on the street. So look at the kind of poverty of thoughts, poverty of intelligence, the person who's representing the government of India. I think we are under the situation of economical and social emergency. The situation is absolutely unbearable. People are dying on the street. People don't have any jobs. I have been walking down to the industrial clusters in the Mumbai-Pune corridor. I can go on the big industrial clusters like Pimpri, Chinchwad, Somatne, Satara, this entire Western Maharashtra belt. And you go to these areas, Salil, that the factories are shut down, the labor contractors are disappeared, the factory owners are not responding to the calls of the workers. Workers are sitting in their the labor camp or the like low income houses where they were living, or the small slums area, and then nobody responding to their calls. The distress calls is coming. We are reaching out to them. I personally met so many workers who didn't eat food from the last 48 hours, 72 hours. And when we are reaching them, and they are saying that, oh my God, you are like God. Like, no, don't consider us a God. We are just like trying to basically do some responsibility. So situation, I can't even explain in the words. I think I would say that similar situation what we saw during the Bengal famine in early 19th century, or during the partition, when the millions of people are walking. I mean, I have been talking to so many friends. I spoke to my friends in Sao Paulo in Brazil, all the lower income countries. I spoke to my friends in Vietnam. I spoke to my friends in Malaysia, Thailand, so many lower income countries, Philippines. Have you seen such situation anywhere in the country where thousands of people are walking on the street? Thousands of people are just walking, where nowhere to go. People are dying on the street. So this is the state of situation. I think we as a nation miserably failed, Salil. And the entire business fraternity has also basically completely shut down all their eyes. They're absolutely brutal towards the workers.
Thank you, Chandan. You're right to point out these issues, and it is something that's it's a matter of shame for anybody who is in a position of power to do something and is not doing about it. Priya, I want to turn to you, and in a way it's a segue again from the challenge that Chandan and others are posing to the business community. Now, you don't represent business community, but you try to make sure that the business acts in a responsible manner and in a manner that respects the dignity and the rights of the people who are the intended beneficiaries of their programs. How do you see the situation, and how does it play out? Because some of the cases that Chandan has spoken about, and even what Shubho has been speaking about, deal with companies that maybe 1 or 2 steps removed from the kind of companies you deal with, because they're part of the supply chain and they're not direct employees. So recognizing the limits of what a company can do, how do you see the situation?
Yeah, so let me just sort of talk you through what we saw happening, right? And there's a lot of bad news and there's some good news. So post the lockdown, 2 things happened. One is, I think there was just absence of clarity in terms of how things were going to unfold. So companies didn't even know how revenues, profits, cash were going to be impacted. Then came this tremendous pressure from stakeholders across the board. I mean, everything that we've heard, right? Because it was employees, it was contract workers, it was small business owners, micro entrepreneurs, people from the supply chain, people from the distribution network, where there were all of these calls for help. And the company didn't even know what their response vis-a-vis the government's response needed to be at that point in time. The third thing that happened is PM Cares, right? Which is, there was a call to action, to all of the companies, and large sums of money went from companies into the government's coffers at a time when the companies couldn't afford to let go of this cash because their own stakeholders needed to be looked after. So as a result, what you saw was I think a tremendous amount of stress that businesses itself underwent. Second, not even, I think, the understanding of what's happening within their supply chains, within their distribution networks, what are their responsibilities, what is the contractor's responsibility, and then just this migration of cash, which was really needed. Now those were all of the bad news, right? Having said that, I think we saw some examples of companies really stepping up, and each of their response was based on their stakeholders. So we saw gig economy companies, and all of you are familiar with, Uber, Zomato, Swiggy, etc., not just putting out money, but asking a lot of other people to make contributions. A lot of that money actually went in the form of direct cash transfers to help migrants. Was that enough? It wasn't, because people were expecting lockdown 1.0. No one was thinking that it was going to be 3 months of a lockdown, right? But some companies had really moved forward and put money into the hands of those that needed them. Within the first few weeks, I think we had supported about 35,000 migrants and just said, here's money, go do what you want. The second response was really to say, if governments are announcing government schemes, how do we ensure that every individual who's eligible gets access to those government schemes? So we tied up with a large number of nonprofits and for-profits to say, anyone who's eligible, how can we ensure that they have that access? The third thing which we're doing right now, and really in partnership with companies, is to say, let's look at these multiple levels, right? Your contract workers, your supply chain, your distribution network, and we have now set up a 50 crore returnable grant fund, which helps individuals or businesses that have suffered losses to really get back on their feet. Gig economy workers are using it in 2 ways. One, you're right, a large number of people just went back home. We have no idea where they're going to come back. So a financial incentive to say, whenever you're ready, here's money to come back and restart your life. The second is a large number of businesses that were shut down, smaller businesses, people are crowding into the gig economy platforms. Think of salons that shut down, right? And now everyone's sort of applying to these gig economy platforms to say, hopefully you will open up. So working capital and reskilling to be able to have people who don't have jobs to really get back jobs. The second example that I thought was very, very powerful for us is one of our own clients who's likely to lay off a large number of people is putting together a collective fund where they're going to other industries who will also see layoffs and new industries that will see some sort of an increase in jobs. And together they're saying, let's reskill and re-employ people at scale. I know my 10,000 workers. I know what skills and experiences they have. I know what you want. How do I systematically move people from industries that will see some sort of a slowdown into industries that will see a boom? So, I think we've seen some remarkable examples of companies also stepping up, knowing that their own resources are limited, their own people need support. I'll give you another example. A large private equity fund we were talking to, and this is one of the largest investors in low-cost housing, said they will go and speak to their portfolio of real estate companies. They'll put in money, the real estate companies match that money, and they want to, over a period of time, ensure that every construction worker who's back on any construction site gets access to a BOCW card, which entitles them to a lot of government money that's sitting in cesspools. Now, I think these are good examples of companies saying, yes, we're undergoing challenges. Yes, we need to look after our own. yeah, our resources are limited. And how do we creatively partner with each other, with philanthropy, with government to really look after workers? Just one more point that I wanted to add is, look, this is the time when people have to, when you talk about purpose-led companies, this is a time when it's obvious who's purpose-led and who's not. Any CEO who is thinking proactively about what happens post layoffs, in my mind, really exemplifies, a leader with purpose. And, the question really is, how do we support them very quickly? Because no single individual or no single institution is going to be able to respond to this. And so really the role that we are playing right now is going stakeholder by stakeholder, industry by industry, migrant worker by migrant worker profile. What they need in urban areas is different from those that have gone back home and who have to now find new jobs and livelihoods. And how do we really construct an ecosystem of support to help them get back on their feet?
Thank you, Priya. Thanks very much. Some very concrete examples of what can be done, but also recognition that companies by definition tend to look after those that are directly impacted by them and affected by them. The stakeholders is the word you use. And clearly because companies are not responsible for the entire situation in a country, they can only do a limited amount. And it's something that all of us need to bear in mind. And even companies, when they make claims of what they are doing, they're not fixing the whole country. They're trying to fix part of the problem. So Darshana, I want to come to you. And now we are almost at the halfway point. So if we can all be a bit brisk in our responses. So Darshana, the question I have, and you touched upon it a little bit when you spoke about particularly vulnerable sectors such as sex workers, but what is going to happen now? I mean, because, working outside the home, working in another city, in a way is empowering for women, because they are in a way flattering the barriers, they're going away in a conservative society in an orthodox setting. And now they're all back and, they've had a huge systemic shock. Is that going to change? And what does it do to the empowerment of women? Very briefly,
yeah. No, thanks, Salil, for that. One of the things that, first of all, we have to understand also where we are in terms of women's participation in the labor force in the first place, right? And Chandan mentioned, and although we've been saying, the economy has really opened up and all of that, from 91 to now, and actually more from 2004 onwards, the female labor force, the formal labor force participation has actually continued to just go down, right? So much so that in 2017-18, we are actually at 17% of formal labor force participation rate for women, right? That's which is contrary to sort of the belief and sort of what we think about when we see hordes of IT sector, gig economy workers and all of that. But slowly, women are actually moving out of the formal labor force participation. Now, what will really happen is the answer is actually depends, right? Really, honestly. And I think it depends on two things. One is the push factors and the other is the pull factors. In the case of push factors, in cases where the women are the sole income earners, right? In many cases where you see the domestic workers who are the primary remittance, they're actually responsible for sending remittance back. I feel they'll have no other option but to actually come back and actually get back into these sort of, migrate again and kind of continue to do this. The second is in terms of, thinking about pull factors, right? And what is the environment that we kind of create? One here, I think that's something that we have to kind of be really careful about is in a recessionary economy, I feel the gender stereotypes will get reinforced, right? Where there are already shortage of, jobs. It is the male income earners who will continue to work, who will get preference in the family to actually work, right? Which will actually set us back in terms of migration and women's empowerment quite a bit, because this has been sort of the discourse that we've been trying to also support with all our partners in terms of ensuring that women move out of their families. And now with predominance where the male income earners get predominance, that there will be a little bit of a setback. The third thing that we kind of talking about, and Priya mentioned a little bit about, let's think about what is the future of work, and what is the environment that we'll create for it. If you actually think about it, and in terms of the kinds of labor where we've seen actually really spurts, there have been employment even in the middle of COVID. These have been in terms of delivery services like your grocery, your supplies, in terms of logistics services, over distance and all of those, right? Or in some cases, healthcare services, which is really heavily subsidized by women. Those are the areas that we've really seen sort of spurts. And in India, we call them volunteers, right? We don't even call them actually workers, most of the healthcare workers. And in those, but many of these, other than the healthcare workers, actually need increased mobility. And even the gig workers need digital enabler. So unless we're able to provide sort of a digital training, massive levels of upskilling in terms of new jobs, massive level of, thinking about provision of either excellent public transportation system or provision of, training them to be more mobile on scooters, bicycles, or whatever, we're going to lose out a whole set of women from the new economy that will kind of come out of COVID. So that's the risk that we see really of this pull factors where, women will actually just move out of the formal labor force even more so, and even the informal labor force in months and years to come.
That's very, very bleak, but thank you for pointing it out. We need to know that. Chinmay, I'm coming next to you, and the question I had is actually in a way asked by someone in our question answer panel, but it's an anonymous question, so I can't say who it is from. I wish I knew. But the question is basically about what can be done in the future by both business and government. I mean, you obviously know the situation historically, and you are witnessing it at present as it unfolds before us. You are in a city which is bearing the brunt, Ahmedabad. I mean, where there's a lot of the drama being played out as we speak of the impact of COVID. And it's also a city that has attracted a lot of people from other parts of India, changing its character a little as well. Where do you see things going, and what can be done in the future?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there are some points on the long term which are, literally like examination points, increased investment in healthcare, better working conditions and so on. But I think something more concrete is, how do we make migrant lives more secure in cities? I think that is really the fundamental point out here. And to that extent, one, we know they lose out on a lot of social security, public social security given by government when they move. So one simple idea of portable social security, which is now on the policy cards, a lot of challenges in implementation, but I think we just need to sit down and sort of thrash it out and get this on board. What now is known as a one nation, one ration card. But the idea that you reduce stress of migrants in cities. Now, as Shubho pointed out on eviction and so on, it is on housing. I mean, the fact that after 100 years after the plague and influenza, when we still have miserable housing conditions, when the migrants are at the mercy of these landlords, how do we get better housing? And for this, maybe we have to look at what China has done with those huge dormitory sort of systems, where public investment in housing has given some modicum of stability to migrant workers when they come. So, on housing and social security, it has to be a much more expansive. And when we talk of portable social security, I think the really there's this whole thing about universalizing, which means everyone has access to social security, which I think almost sort of services is a fantastic idea. But universalizing and being able to sort of access that service anywhere in India, and I think that is very, very important. In terms of businesses, the fact that businesses usually outsource everything. I mean, for example, we are on a university campus where virtually every basic service on campus is outsourced, means that there's a fundamental problem here where businesses have no clues about workers and tend to sort of dismiss all concerns, saying, but that is a contractor's issue. And workers have also no sort of real access to businesses, saying, we are dealing mostly with contractors, and especially in the construction sector. This complete breakdown between the employer and sort of the employee, these are, why are this contract? Because what we've seen in this crisis is that contractors have fled, and so the migrants are stuck and the businesses are also stuck. So even well-meaning businesses don't know what to do because they never really engaged with their employees. And so that is why this lessening the power of the contractor by some more direct interface, that has to be on the cards for everyone. And so, I've been in talks with CREDI, which is a construction body of India, and they seem to be committed to this idea that this over reliance on the contractor Raj, so to speak, has to reduce, because the construction sector of India is right now the worst hit. Virtually all construction projects across the country have stalled, and this is going to sort of really take that. So portability of social security, more connect with employees are something which I feel are doable. For example, this whole thing would have not been necessary if we had a decent healthcare system in place. We would not have to go for such a drastic lockdown. I think the rationale of the lockdown was the fact that we don't have good health facilities. And I was just reading today something on the influenza. These were concerns voiced 100 years back. The British are not spending enough on health, and that's the serious. So I'm more skeptical on those. I don't think that's going to happen immediately. I think these other things might make more sense, because if migrants can access these things anywhere, they get a voice. And then they can, because right now they have no political voice, because their political voice is only the state where they came from. It's only when you have some access, when you can demand from the center saying, I need food in XYZ, and I don't have to run to the state government. I think that is really when migrants will get some buy. Because without political voice in India, I don't think anything happens.
Yeah, we need to reimagine how the country is administered, which is not an easy task at all. But thank you for saying that, Chinmay. Shubho, you reflected, you heard voices directly, and you've also heard our panelists, and you work with companies. So are there some specific 2 or 3 things that you think companies can do to alleviate the hardship in future? Again, quickly.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just, the first thing is change the stance. So currently, business and human rights is a subject handled by one specific function for the purpose of compliance and reporting. Whereas I think the new mantra should be business and human rights is a value or an ideology, which is handled by a cross-functional initiative. So it's not the baby of the CSR or the sustainability function. It's not the baby of the HR. It's a baby of all functions. Okay. And it's not only for compliance and reporting. It is for sustainability of business. Because what we tend to miss out on 2 facts. These migrant workers are also the key influencers. When they go back to the villages, they introduce new products from the perspective of consumerism. They're also the first ones to educate other people in terms of financial literacy or tech literacy. How did the mobile phone reach there? How did the people were convinced to join the gig economy? Use the map. Somewhere these are the people. These are the people who have worked in Mumbai, gone back to Bihar, saying, I know how to use this map because in the Uber, I have learned how to do that. So that's the first point I will try to make. In terms of supply chain, and somebody has asked the question, how people are using behavioral science and what a corporate is doing that. I'll merge that answer with this. Now, there's a lot of talk about how supply chain and the entire assembly line would be realigned because there would be social distancing. And currently at Bias, my organization, we are studying CXOs. So we're talking to 100 odd CXOs to learn from them. And the series of papers are being written for Economic Times, which I'm co-writing, is that what they're thinking. And interesting, they're looking at innovation not from the perspective of assembly line, but from the perspective of social distancing. Now, if you have better gear, then the 6 feet of distance can be brought down to 3 feet. That means doubling the production line. And that's another strong area that people are looking at. Because social distancing is currently a temporary solution. Better gears, better stuff can loosen that. The last point I'll talk about is this entire fact about statistics. As Sudarshan very rightly said, or Chinmay was talking about, we do not have data on migrant workers. You would be amazed that there is no particular data that how many migrant workers are there. Because there's an enumeration problem from research perspective. Because if the rural municipality calculates then, once they go back, the village, there's a duplication. So companies should now finally have a register. They should get into the process of registering that who are these, and they should be collected properly. And so that at least we know by gender, by category, that, okay, there's a Ram, there's a Sham, they are my migrant workers. There's no data. So from my perspective, that's what companies are currently looking at or planning to do.
No, the databases are useful, but of course, you should always be worried. I put my human rights hat on and realize that the database can also have significant security and privacy implications.
Yes. Yeah, true.
That Hindu who's a Muslim and who lives where and which caste they belong to. And so who has the data, who controls it and keeps it for how long, and what purpose it is used for? Those are extremely important questions. But your point is well taken, that we do need better data. And also, I think someone has raised this question, and I don't know whether we'll get the chance to address it, that, why are we calling them migrant workers? Absolutely the right question. They are all Indian citizens, and why should they be seen as outsiders? But that takes us even deeper into profound political questions, such as this situation in Assam and Kashmir and everywhere. And we don't even want to go there, but it's something worth bearing in mind, that who is from where and why does it matter? I just thought I'll put it out there. Chandan, I want to come to you. And I think I want to, again, very quickly, if you can think of some contractual assurances that you think would be better for workers in future in terms of their employee rights as employees. Because so many of the people, I mean, we've heard about debt bondage, which Vani spoke about, but it also is a domestic situation. It happens in India too. And these contracts are unenforceable. They're voided often. And you have thought deep, long and hard on the whole idea of decent work as an agenda. So we know all the great solutions that we need, but again, concretely, are there a couple of things that you think should be done to make it contractually a more secure situation for the workers?
Thank you, Salil. First of all, I think I was hearing Priya, Shubhro, and also Chinmay. I think Priya and I have shared one more panel, and also with Chinmay, one of the TV debate. So I completely agree what they're talking about. And, people like me, like a labor rights activist like me, I always get, so suspicious about that. What I say in Hindi, kathni or karni mein antar hai. So when you say something, you have to also, what you preach, you have to also practice in that. And if you don't practice, then I get a lot of suspicion about that. I give you a few examples, very quick examples, and maybe my fellow speakers can also add on that. See, what happened in Supreme Court today, there's a 38-page order, and you can please just read that what government is proposing. Government has just given a kind of very ad hoc order that please, in next 15 days, please repatriate all the workers, giving a direction to the state governments and the central government, please, prepare some kind of the random schemes and all. And then people like me, again, will be reading like a big affidavit, will be filing by the state reports, 800 page, 900 page, and will have nothing. It's just kind of repackaging all the schemes. But my main worry is about the whole questions. Chinmay talked about the CRIDAI, and just few days ago, the CRIDAI was trying to, stall the process of repatriation of migrant workers from Karnataka, and that became a very huge hue and cry. And everybody started calling it's a bonded labor situation. How can you stop somebody's, mobility and all, etc. So look at the CRIDAI, basically the whole stances and positions. Same goes with one of the matter which I'm fighting in Supreme Court about the Ficus Private Limited. The large number of association is coming and filing in the cases in Supreme Court that we won't be able to pay the minimum wages, or we can, release the wages which are withheld, and the entire industrial fraternity is basically supporting the idea. So and this is the second point. The third point is that we know the situation across the country, and now we are doing the labor law reform. We are doing a reform where we are saying that you cannot make the unions, you cannot talk about the collective bargaining, you cannot ask for the minimum wages, you cannot ask about the basic minimum wages. Look at the way the UP government has already amended the labor law reform. MP is doing. So many states is trying to do the kind of competition where they want to weaken the labor laws. I mean, these labor laws are, kind of fought over last 100 years. They came all from the very hard fought struggle. And suddenly the government is trying to basically weaken this law. So what we are trying to do, Salil, we are disrespecting these migrant workers. They're going back home. Now we are calling them, please come back. You have to work 18 hours. We won't be able to pay the minimum wages. What kind of society we are trying to build? Look at the kind of social unrest which is already being reported across the country. Are we putting this whole country as a system into the authoritarian regime or what? I'm not understanding that. So I don't understand. The business fraternity talks very, very good words. I really appreciate, really respect that. But as far as the practice is concerned, they are not cooperating at all as far as the basic labor laws are concerned. So I'm really worried, and what government is trying to do at this moment in the name of the, increasing the production or increasing the economic growth. You read the World Bank indicators. Nowhere mentioned is that the changing labor laws or kind of diluting the labor laws will basically bring you investment or increase the business. If you read these top 10 indicators, so I don't know who are these people guiding Prime Minister or guiding the government of India on those questions. I think I'm personally really disturbed on this whole fact that the way things are unfolding, the entire business fraternity, I really wish that they will do well, but as if today they are behaving anti-worker, and I'm really upset about it.
No, I think the point you make about the World Bank, again, there are two parts of the bank, I would think. And Priya, you know the international system better than I do in these regard, with all your work at the Poverty Lab that you have done in the past at MIT. But the question I have is, you have the ease of doing business indicators, which a lot of people swear by. And I think
correct, absolutely.
The government kept saying, I think in the last, trying to compare how this government is doing compared to the last government of Dr. Manmohan Singh, and trying to compare as though it was a race. And, whenever I see these indicators, the question I have is that it does not really make a difference whether you are doing better than Vietnam, because the worker in India doesn't have the choice of, being in another country. He has to work in, or she has to work in India. And how you are doing with your own past is more important than how we are doing in comparison with another. But that's just an editorial point, which you can take it or leave it. Vani, I wanted to come to you because I think Chandan has raised the point about what companies can do. And again, very briefly, because we are now nearly, we have about 25 minutes left before we end, and we have some questions to go through. But Vani, to you, how has the response been from the corporate sector in the Gulf region to this crisis?
Frankly, it hasn't been great. There are certain legacy projects in each of these countries, like the Dubai Expo in the UAE or the World Cup projects and Qatar Foundation in Qatar. Within those legacy projects, they make sure the standards are high, as they've always done, and they try to protect even the subcontractors. But otherwise, the businesses are so badly hit that the relief measures announced by the governments very early on, except in the case of Qatar, all the other governments only looked at protecting businesses, so waiving rentals or utilities and taxes in some cases. They didn't really include migrant workers. Qatar did make available a $3 billion fund for companies to take as loans to make sure migrant worker wages are protected. But the truth is, after 2 months, companies haven't taken that loan because they don't know where the business is headed. They don't know if they can take on an added liability or loan to the government when they're not sure if their businesses will survive. So this goes back to the original thing about the kafala and how anyone can open a business. If you're a national there, you'll be allowed to recruit workers. No real due diligence is done. So a lot of leeway was given to citizens to recruit foreigners without really holding them accountable. And you see that. Again, when you look at corporations, multinational corporations tend to deal with it better, but not always. There's a very big French company in the UAE which hasn't paid workers for a few months, and they haven't paid workers in Qatar either. I don't want to name companies now. And then you have a lot of highly profitable companies, Indian-owned, Indian-registered as well, who have defaulted on payments. Now, all of these countries have said that if you can't pay workers, you have to ensure you provide them food and accommodation. Even with this, they haven't met the obligations, resulting in a huge community charity mobilization, which basically means companies are not being held accountable, and individuals with deep pockets or with good intentions end up covering these things. We didn't speak about gender in the Gulf thing, and Salil, you and I spoke at length about domestic workers, and that goes back to what Shubho mentioned about how human rights cannot be a department within the corporate setup. It has to be a culture, and if that is respected, then automatically domestic workers are respected. But one very important point is about subcontracting, similar to what Chinmay mentioned. Most companies, if you go on BHRRC and you look at their surveys, you'll realize more than 50 to 60% of boots on the ground are subcontracted workers. Companies do not want to do direct recruitment because recruitment is difficult. They don't want to take responsibility. And then when things go wrong and the subcontracting chain can go like 10, 11 levels down, they might monitor the first 2 subcontractors and then just drop the ball on the rest. And that's where we see most of the problems: manpower supply companies, warehousing of workers, and in facilities management, which includes cleaning, which is highly feminized sector, you find a lot of women stranded there. Now, one thing that the Indian government should start looking into is a lot of Indian-owned businesses or Indians-run businesses in the Gulf tend to have very, very poor practices. And the owners quickly just leave the workers stranded and return because they have a visa that allows them to exit and enter whenever they want, which is not true for all workers. So they just come back to India and they have their backup. They're not held accountable in India. Whereas if they have cheated the Gulf government, then there's all kinds of processes bilateral processes between governments to make sure that these businessmen pay back. But when it comes to workers, the Indian government doesn't hold them accountable, even when they know which are the businesses that are still operating in India. So I think there has to be some kind of a cross-border litigation process or accountability mechanism as well. I'll stop here.
Yeah, thanks. Priya, I wanted to come to you, and this is about what companies can do again. And there just happens to be a question from Cynthia Peterson here. What can foreign companies operating in India do to ensure respect for migrant workers? And I think what I want to do is reflect on that, but also large Indian companies about how they can have more impactful corporate giving and priority setting. Should they listen more? Should they redesign their CSR programs? How should they address the situation as we go forward?
Yeah, Chinmay made a very good point. And it just occurred to me as he was speaking that if I were to think of even within the companies that we work with, the ones that responded quickly, comprehensively, with a lot of empathy, those are companies for whom workers are the lifeblood of their system. And you're absolutely right. The more layers removed the leadership is from the worker on the ground, the more feeble their response, right? I mean, this is systemic. Now, the question is, how do you start breaking some of these boundaries? And I really liked Shaboz's example also, an idea of saying that it can't be a department, it needs to be a horizontal. The question is, how does one do it? Now, there's various mechanisms, right? I think one is, I mean, maybe data or insights that show how critical these workers are to the business itself. And I really like the examples that were mentioned, which is to say, how did mobile phones penetrate really, the good that migrant workers do. And I think the more evidence we build, in their defense. The second is changing practices and norms across the board. Is that going to be easy? No, it's not, right? The third is also, I think, a more collaborative mechanism between government, between philanthropy, between corporates. And I think somebody else made the point, Vani, you did, to say, companies kind of were absolved of their responsibilities and other philanthropists and individuals kind of had to step in. And we've seen, a large number of nonprofits who in any case are losing legitimacy very, very quickly in India. They were the first responders in terms of feeding people, in terms of looking after migrants, right? So in a situation like this, I think there are two questions. One, what can be done immediately? And I think for us, the experience, at least in the last 1 month, has been really quite outstanding, because even as we were setting up this 50 crore fund, MSDF or Moderator network.
Rupees for those, that 500 million rupees for those who are not from India or South Asia. I just thought I'll clarify, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a fairly large mechanism, but we have 3 large funders, Omidiyar Network, MSDF, and Ford Foundation, who are coming together to say, create a returnable grant. There is one outcome only, which is the individual that we are reaching out to, has he or she been able to get back on their feet? Everyone's success metrics are dependent on that one outcome, right? It's a returnable grant, which means we give a very flexible grant to the individual or the micro entrepreneur. They have to pay back. When can they pay back? Only when their incomes reach a level of stability, right? So all of us are fully aligned. Now, the way we are even sort of customizing it is that each company, each execution partner, each profile of migrant worker can use it in his or her way. So the quantum, the support, the repayment period, everything is highly flexible based on the context of the individual. So for the first, I think what's very heartening is philanthropists coming in and saying, create a mechanism that helps business, contractors, and individuals get back on their feet in ways that they seem fit, right? As opposed to actually enforcing anything. The second thing that we're doing is talking extensively with government. A lot of schemes have been announced now for MSMEs, for women, etc., to say, how do you start leveraging government schemes wherever possible? And third is to this point of, can we also celebrate responsible companies? Let's make the ones that are doing the right things look as good as they can amongst their peer base, so that no other company says, but I didn't know how to do it, right? At least this, I didn't know how to do it, needs to go away. Let's collectively document and champion use cases of responsible companies. And let's also, it's a shame that I'm hearing a lot of this today for the first time, because technically I should be working with Chandan and I should be working with Shubho and with Chinmay and with others to say, what is the data that you're hearing from the ground? How can we be a listening organization and a listening set of partners so that we are responding based on need? Things are changing very, very rapidly. What was true yesterday is not going to be true, 2 months down the line. And how can we be constantly responsive? I think the other point I wanted to make is just the issue of gender. And how we design schemes, how we deliver support has to be inherently very, very different from women compared to men. So even the kind of systems, the processes, the services we are building in are being designed completely different from the outset. The outcomes are different. For example, one of the outcomes that we want to track is, age of marriage. Through our support, this may not be true for men, but for women, are we delaying age of marriage? Are we delaying some of the other indicators which are so critical to ensure that women's empowerment is looked at not just now, but in the future, right? Going back to the question, how can companies respond? A, I think to really step up at a time of crisis. B, I think to be as collaborative and coordinated. All of us understand that resources are at a minimal right now. And how can we be creative in terms of coordinating efforts? This is really the first time that we've seen companies make very, very quick decisions. Within a week, you hear a need and companies are responding, right? How do we capitalize on that momentum? Third, I think this is the first time that we are seeing governments, at least in our very limited experience, coming and saying, we need help, we don't have the answers. And instead of us, instead of putting fatwas on companies saying, look, you really need to step up. Tell us what we do, tell us what you do, and tell us how to make this work. And the last thing I want to say is that this is a really good time to use quick responses and make them best practices going forward, right? Whatever people are doing right now, let that really get systematized and really ingrained in their own behaviors. So what we are attempting to do is really bring in agencies like the UN, bring in philanthropists, bring in government, bring in companies so that responsibilities are shared. It's clear who needs to do what right now, but who needs to do what in the future so that situations like this don't occur. And then the third is really build strong alliances with people on the panel, but other people who are doing exceptional work so that all decisions are informed by the most vulnerable. Processes, systems need to be created based on that end person who doesn't have the same level of power or voice that we have. This is the moment to do it, and we can't let go.
It's absolutely, that's a very good stirring call that you have made. Chinmay, I wanted to turn to you, but there is a gentleman called Muhammad Alam Ansari who has asked a question that kind of raises the same point I was going to come to you with. And again, putting on your academic hat and looking at the workers who are both within and outside India moving and the paradigm shift that's going on. His question is more practical and to the point that the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which those not from India would want to know that it's a very large welfare scheme funded by the state. It has set new records on the number of person days of work being generated and household benefiting, particularly in the month of May. And the figure he has cited is 417.7 million person days of work, which is a 13% rise from a year earlier. Given that kind of data, what is the capacity of the system to continue dealing with additional pressures? Because you were talking about the portability of the welfare system. So if you can just put on that think tanky hat that you have, and reflect on it. And very quickly, because we have 15 minutes and I do want to get through.
Very quickly, in terms of the numbers, what you're seeing is going to be the max. It's not going to go beyond this for the simple reason a lot of the people who went back are not the kind of people who are going to do Manrega work, right? So there's huge gradation across skills. So most of these guys, in fact, I would say who have gone back, I mean, we are talking the poorest of the poor who will actually apply for Manrega for this, and that's how Manrega is designed in the first place. So a lot of people actually just waiting to come back to the cities. Should we have a urban version of Manrega? I think that's a very valid question to ask. So because Manrega is the rural welfare scheme, do we need to have an urban welfare scheme? And I think now is probably a good time to devise it. But the problem in that is that, it would have to pass this muster of interstate sort of politics. Because what we've seen in this crisis in India is a breakdown of interstate coordination. So what we're going to have is, for example, the case of a government in Maharashtra saying, why should we provide welfare services to a migrant who has come from outside? Right? And so it's all these fiscal problems which constrain rolling out an urban sort of welfare program. But in principle, I think now is the time, maybe not as expansive, but maybe for, maybe not all year round, but maybe for a few months. More than that, I think an unemployment insurance, I think that is more practical in urban areas than a all-out sort of Manrega equivalent. Do we have the capacity to do that? Unfortunately, this is like a recession year, so the government finances are stretched. But I think the capacity has to be increased on multiple levels. So health, of course, we know is one, but providing welfare services in urban areas is definitely other. But the Manrega thing, it's not going to go more. So I think it's stretched to capacity now. But it was designed precisely for this as a shock absorber, and it's doing its job.
Thank you.
Yes,
please, Chandan.
Just want to add, the Himachal Pradesh government has introduced Urban Narega in form of the schemes, and Odisha government has also allocated 1,000 crores, maybe you can just translate in dollars, Salil, and that money is also going to focus on employment opportunities. Yeah, I just wanted to add these factual information.
No, that's very, very useful to know, because I think it takes in the direction that we should be thinking that, because poverty is generic and it's across the country, and it's not necessarily the most vulnerable are not only in one part of the country. So that's always useful to bear in mind. Shubho, I want to come to you too, Sudarshana. So Shubho, very briefly, what kind of behavior changes that you would want to see in the companies as we go forward? How can such behavior be nudged and changed? And there were a couple of questions also. I'm just trying to scroll through and see. There was one more for you, but anyway, for now, at least if you can talk very briefly about the behavior change. Yeah.
Okay, the behavior change. So my study focuses on the kind of transformative leadership skills that post-COVID, the CXOs are looking at. And it's very interesting to understand, and I'll quote this, okay, is that in the survey, we had given a list of personality traits and attributes, and soft skills seem to be the future. So soft skills are supposed to be the most tough skills to have coming back. So rather than the guy with an aggressive go-getter one, what companies are looking at is that no, competitive spirits are good. What CXOs are looking at, collaboration. So collaborative leadership, where instead of aggressive leadership, people are looking at from behavioral change perspective, the word that they're using is that, authentic leadership, where the leader is not scared to say, I'm in a vulnerable position. I do not know what's going to happen tomorrow, but I can plan things better, but we're all together. So that the point that Priya and others were saying, there's no panic.
The question, my friend Kevin, who has been tracking the questions with me, has just told me the exact question was, and I'll very quickly tell you what it was, that are there examples of companies in India which may have used behavioral science theories?
Yes.
And again, very quickly, because we are running.
Sure. So the way they're doing is that what we saw that because of this, the government and others strongly promoting that fake news should not be there. And what has happened on the other side was overcompensation. So we did a small experiment where we asked the migrant workers to send back all the information that they had got regards to COVID. And guess what? They were scared to send it back. Now that's very dangerous. Because if you're scared, you're not disseminating information. So what companies are saying, rather than talking only about fake and others, they're looking at smart communication. And what the kind of experiments that they're doing, is the same message can be said in 2-3 ways. We're trying to find out which one is the more easier way to do. For example, I can say, wear a mask, it is mandated, you will be punished. So that's a mandatory message. Or I can say, wear a mask because you will be benefited, which is about individual, the same message. Or third, I can say, from what we call the social norm style, is that wear a mask because everybody else is wearing. Or the fourth way I can say, what's a pro bono? Wear a mask to save others. Now, we interchangeably use this in our communication, but there got to be a behavioral science, research and data to say which one is more effective.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. Sudarshana, I want you to briefly touch on the international frameworks that might be able to be brought into this picture to safeguard the rights. And there's a question from Ripal Gupta, which actually talks about what kind of legal frameworks can be developed. I'm paraphrasing the question. What does India need to change, particularly in light of women and children and their rights? So in a way, if you can combine the two and look at international frameworks and what kind of legislations changes can be brought here. We have 8 minutes. I'm just letting everyone know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'll just be very brief with this and not get into the details. So first of all, in terms of the kind of recognition of the Universal Human Rights of Declaration, because your Article 23 of Universal Human Rights Declaration really talks about the rights of workers, right? And so that's the broadest mandate that all of us really have in terms of international legal frameworks, right? And then in terms of looking at the whole SDG frameworks, SDG 8 and SDG 10 in particular, SDG 8 and a target 8.8 actually specifically talks of decent work for migrant workers, looking at both, and especially for women migrant workers, and so does target 8.5 in terms of productive and employment for all. And target 10 as well, it actually really talks of facilitating orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration. There's a specific target to it. And we can think about how do we report against these targets, and can we make those more transparent, clear, and make states in India report against some of these. And when we're talking of kind of safe migration, the Global Compact itself on safe, orderly, and regular migration really specifically lays down guidelines, including for the private sector, in terms of providing facilities for responsible migration, including in terms of recruitment that Vani kind of mentioned, right? And I'm Vani sure I would know much more about this. But those are specifically kind of provided. There are a whole bunch of ILO kind of guidelines, ILO conventions, the fundamental conventions that are there for ILO, and Chandan would know them more. And then there are migrant worker specific conventions, Convention 97, 86, 143, 151. There is a convention around domestic workers specifically, which is 189. And then there is a recent convention, which is where part of it we've actually, in a way, India's done better in terms of the sexual and harassment workplace. There's a recent convention around gender-based violence in the supply chain and responsibility of employers to kind of commit to it. So those are sort of broad convention. The other thing I think where we kind of also talking of, really talking of getting companies sort of the nudging behavior. I feel that if we can get more companies, and this is from a gender lens in terms of the women's empowerment principles, and getting companies to sign up for it and show where they stand in terms of those web principles, and include sort of their commitment to contract workers along the supply chain as part of the web principle. And if you can have the data really presented and encourage, if there is 1 or 2 thought leaders and corporates who kind of take that, and then 1 or 2 of them then kind of, and that becomes sort of the standard, like we have for the GRI standards, like the environmental standards. Can we really think about, labor rights standards and web or similar standards could be something that we could really think about. So I'll leave there. There are enough to kind of actually hold governments accountable. It's just what Chandan mentioned, from that sort of the normative to the practice. That's where we kind of fail.
Yeah, we have 4 minutes, but I do want to come back to Chandan, to Vani, and to Priya. So 1 minute each, please, not more than that. But Vani, I want to start with you first, because we have spoken in the past about the protect, respect, remedy framework of business and human rights. And, you know, Sudarshana has given a very good account of the standards that do apply. Is that the way forward in the context of the Indian or developing country worker abroad? Very quickly.
Yeah, I think what we need to keep in mind is workers do not have collective bargaining power in the Gulf, migrant workers, which means corporates need to take more responsibility and governments need to put alternatives in place till such a time unions are allowed. Another thing is a recognition that dependence on migrant workers is not going to reduce in any of the Gulf countries because the fertility rates are down, and countries like UAE and Qatar, more than 90% of the labor market are migrants. So whatever they're doing in terms of repatriation or layoffs is a temporary fix that will have such terrible impact on workers. Corporates need to keep that in mind. And finally, one point on bankruptcy and insolvency, because Darshana also mentioned ILO conventions. There is a convention that says wages are privileged, employees are privileged creditors, wages have to be paid off first. This is not true in practice in the Gulf. As we see more insolvency coming up in the coming months, we need to ensure workers' wages are protected. That's prioritized. So these are the main things that I want to cover. 1 minute.
Yeah, thank you so much. Chandan, I did have a question about issues, but you've already addressed them. So I'm going to ask you a question which we had not discussed earlier. If you were to meet a migrant worker from Jharkhand, would you tell her to go to a city or would you tell her to stay where she is?
It's a very, very complex question, Salil. I mean, very complex question. I mean, I have been researching, talking to myself and asking a lot of people that what is the best, sending people to the cities, because I personally feel that cities are very, very brutal, kind of space. So I feel that I would like to remember Gandhiji's and his idea of Gram Swaraj. I feel that we need to build the rural economy. We need to build the kind of economy where all the, the rural population can, build their autonomous economical kind of structure where they can survive their livelihoods. I don't want to basically people to migrate and go and live like an animal in slums and poor income houses, get not paid at minimum wages. Is a very, very brutal thing. I just want to add one more. At this moment, I think Sudarshana has spoken very, very well about the work, and this is what we about the US principle of IDPs, internally displaced people, and that's the situation we are in right now as far as India is concerned. I think, and it was heard very well by the bench. But this moment, I'm not sure if the entire panel is aware about that. For the first time in the last 50 years, all the central trade unions have complained to International Labour Organizations, ILO, and ILO DG, the guy Ryder, has done sent a formal letter to the Prime Minister of India that what you're trying to do, India being a founding member of ILO, and you're trying to weaken all the labor is unacceptable. So I think our all the processes and the way the business fraternity is doing, I would really request all my colleagues, especially Priya and others, that please help us to get connected with the business fraternity, and we want to talk to them. We want to basically come on the same table. We would like to have some kind of what I would say that the collective bargaining. India being a founding member of ILO, we have a principle of collective bargaining and the tripartite association. We like to sit with the table, want to understand the problem. So I think at this moment, let's not shame our labor laws. It's one of the best laws and let's not weaken that so that we have bad names in front for that.
Thank you, Chandan. You're breaking off a little, but I think what you were saying at the end, if I can paraphrase, was the need for collective bargaining and for the tripartite declaration and remembering those and mainstreaming those, given that India had a pioneering role in the setting up of the ILO. Priya, I think this is the last word from you, as I'm turning to you, which is that how receptive are companies in listening to these messages? Or do they are they seeing it in the short or long term, and how do you see this play out? Yeah.
So in our, again, limited experience, we've seen companies being very receptive if you go to them with solutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you only go to them with problems, they don't have the mind space right now to come up with solutions. So go to them with a win-win-win framework and they will listen. Give them, so one of the things that we came up with this morning, right, is a CEO worker alliance. Now, is it a CEO worker alliance? Just take away all of the layers in the middle and get that CEO to start talking to that last person on their shop floor. Because only then will you build empathy, respect, and understanding of these two as individuals, right? Not as, pay employer, employee, or whatever else. But I think this is the time really to not just build empathy, but to build these collaborative solutions. And in some sense, we need to do the hard work. I don't think you can expect senior leadership in corporates to come up with a framework for for solutions. It really is up to us to create what we think is a win-win and then go to them and have them take ownership for it, because ultimately, they have to drive these initiatives.
So before I conclude, just one final thought, because one recurring theme from all of you has been is about that man from Porbandar, who was born 150 years ago and whose message resonates across the world. Whatever he says, whatever, it continues to resonate and meaning. He was not perfect, but he was getting closer to that than many of us will in our own lifetime. And this was his last talisman, which is what he said. And I think the CEO Worker Alliance that you were speaking of, Priya, and earlier, the Mahatma Gandhi NREG, the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, has been spoken about both by Chandan and by Chinmay. And his name has not been used in vain by many. So just let's remember that talisman. All it said was that whenever you're trying to make any policy initiative, whenever you want to take any step in future, think of the most poor, most vulnerable, and the most marginalized person. And ask yourself if the step that you're about to take is going to help him or her or not. And once you take that into account, all your doubts will melt away. And if only those who have the power were to take that into account and amend their behavior, then a lot of the troubles will get mitigated, alleviated, and we might get closer to the kind of Swaraj that Chandan, you have spoken about. And all 6 of you have been working so hard in achieving in their own individual way. And all these things are built step by step and so on. And so all the best with all your work. I've learned a lot from this panel. We had lots of questions. I'm sorry we could not go through all of them, but thank you so much for staying with us. I know it's been a long day for many of you, and all the best, and may it be a better tomorrow for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.